This week, we will begin talking about other market structures aside from perfect competition. The first one we're going to talk about is basically the other extreme. So perfect competition is one extreme of a market structure. The other extreme is a monopoly. So in this first lecture for monopolies, we're going to talk about how monopolies are created and how monopolists make decisions about how much to charge and how much to produce, and how to figure out a monopolist's profits. So just because we are no longer talking about perfect competition doesn't mean you guys can forget about it. We will be referencing the material from perfect competition a lot because it is our benchmark to compare other market structures. So just as a reminder about the main points of perfect competition. So for perfect competition to exist, we must have a competitive marketplace. We have to have many buyers and many sellers, and they must be selling basically the same good. And there must be easy entry and exit from the market. And that allows prices to act as signals for sellers to either enter the market or to leave the market in the long run. So because there are so many sellers, we consider that each seller is a price taker. So that means that they have no control over the price in the marketplace. They can choose to charge the market price. If they charge less than the market price, and they can basically sell as much as they could if they charged exactly the market price. So they would never charge less than the market price. And if they charged more than the market price, then no one would buy anything from them. So basically firms are going to charge the market price. So what firms are going to do is try and maximize their profits, and they're going to do that by producing at a quantity where marginal revenue, which remember is just equal to the price in that situation, is equal to marginal cost. Okay, so what is a monopoly? Well, a monopoly is a market where there is one single seller who produces a good. And the reason that monopolies will arise is because of something called barriers to entry. So if a monopolist is making a profit, then normally in the long run other firms would enter the market, and that would drive the price down until the monopolist is no longer making a profit. But something prevents that from happening in a monopoly market. So think about a market that is not a monopoly anymore. So for example, think about smartphones. So 5 or 6 years ago, Apple introduced the first smartphone, the iPhone. And for a while, Apple had a monopoly on that market. But because Apple made money hand over fist, other firms entered, prices of smartphones have dropped dramatically, and Apple is no longer making as much money on its smartphones as it once was. So what could cause barriers to entry? Well, one thing could be control of scarce resources. The classic example here are diamonds. And another good example, although it's not really true anymore, is aluminum. So in the early 1900s, Alcoa, which is short for the Aluminum Company of America, owned 90% of the world's bauxite, and that is basically the essential ingredient in making aluminum. And Alcoa basically bought up all of the bauxite mines in the world and had a monopoly. De Beers, also back in the early 1900s, bought 90% of the diamond mines in the world. So De Beers basically had a monopoly on diamonds. Another barrier to entry could be the inability of potential competitors to raise enough capital. So you could think about someone who wants to start a business to compete with a monopoly. Monopolies are usually very, very large, so a competitor might not be able to convince investors that they will be a viable competitor, may not be able to raise money. So other natural barriers to entry might be economies of scale. So in the last section, we talked about economies of scale, And we talked about that as average costs falling as output increases. So you could think about an example here. Just think about what you think could be done at an overall lower cost. So we could have 100 car producers making 10 cars each, or we could have 2 car producers making 500 cars each. In both cases, 1,000 cars are made. But due to the nature of cost structure of car production, which exhibits economies of scale, the average costs are going to fall as output increases. So the 2 firms producing 500 cars each will have lower costs. So in this situation, we kind of naturally have monopolies arise because bigger companies can produce things at a lower cost. So when we have this situation, this is called a natural monopoly. So a single large firm is going to have lower costs than potential competitors. And you'll see natural monopolies a lot when you think about utilities. So utilities have declining marginal costs, economies of scale, so you naturally have monopolies arise. So this creates kind of a conundrum. We'll talk about the problems with monopolies in the next lecture, but if you try to break up a natural monopoly, you can actually worsen the outcomes than what you had with the monopoly. Another way that monopolies are often created is from the government. So the government will also create monopolies through licenses and qualifications. So you think about taxi cabs. So the only people who can drive taxi cabs, the only company that can manage taxi cabs are often the government created taxi cab monopoly. So a lot of times governments create monopolies. We already talked about the pharmaceutical industry, but governments create monopolies through granting patents. So governments create monopolies through offering patents, temporarily giving firms the exclusive right to produce something, and that provides an incentive to innovate. Okay, so what is our monopolist going to do? Well, since the monopolist is the only game in town in terms of selling product, it differs in what control it has of its prices. So remember, we called firms in perfectly competitive markets price takers because they cannot affect the price. Well, that means that each firm faces a perfectly horizontal demand curve. So they have one price at which they can sell as much as they want. They don't really have any other price that they can sell at. Well, a monopolist has control over the price. Since it's the only game in town, its demand curve is the downward sloping market demand curve. So the monopolist has a decision to make here on what price to charge. Charge a lower price, you'll sell more. Charge a higher price, you'll sell less, but you'll make more money on each unit that you sell. So graphically, here's what our demand curves will look like. Competitive firm on the left, monopolist on the right. So here, recall, is our perfectly competitive firm's demand curve, perfectly horizontal. Our monopolist demand curve is going to be our market demand curve, downward sloping. So our monopolist is still going to maximize profits by choosing a quantity level where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. But what's different is, although in perfect competition, price was equal to marginal revenue, with a monopoly, price is going to be greater than marginal revenue. So we're going to go into depth about why this is, but for now, just remember, perfect competition, price is equal to marginal revenue. Marginal revenue is that horizontal line right at the price. With monopoly, we're going to have a downward sloping demand curve and a downward sloping marginal revenue curve. Okay, so why is the monopolist's marginal revenue downward sloping? Well, we can look at this and examine this with this table. So the first 2 columns on the left show quantities that a monopolist could sell and the price that the monopolist would have to charge in order to sell that amount of quantity. So the first thing we can do is calculate the total revenue for each quantity and price combination just by multiplying the two numbers together. So if we do that, we get these total revenue numbers in the third column. So what I want you to note is that the revenue doesn't always go up as the monopolist decreases its price. It first goes up, but then it starts to go down. So notice that the revenue is maximized at price of 50, quantity of 5,000. That gives us total revenue of 250,000. So we can calculate the marginal revenue just by looking at the difference between the total revenues and the quantities. So the first part at the top, you can see the marginal revenue is increasing. So when we go from quantity of 0 to a quantity of 1,000, our revenue goes from 0 to 90,000. So our marginal revenue for the 1,000 customers is 90,000. So that would mean our marginal revenue is actually 90. So then when we go from 1 to 2,000 customers, our revenue goes from 90,000 to 160,000. So our marginal revenue goes to 70,000. So you can see that our marginal revenue is kind of downward sloping, but at least so far it's positive. Well, then once we go from selling 5,000 to 6,000 units, our revenue actually decreases by $10,000. So then our marginal revenue is negative. So why is this? Well, there's two things that happen when a monopolist decides to sell more units of output. Well, the first thing is that if a monopolist wants to sell more, it has to decrease its price. So all the units that the monopolist sells are now sold at a lower price. So this is going to decrease the revenue for the monopolist. This is known as the price effect. But the monopolist is now selling more units. So that's a gain in revenue. So this is known as the output effect. So we have these two effects that are working against each other. And whichever one dominates is going to determine whether marginal revenue is positive and revenue is going up, or marginal revenue is negative and revenue is going down. So we can see this graphically. You can draw a demand curve. It looks like this. And it just so happens that this is our marginal revenue curve. So let's say that our monopolist is here. It's charging a price of $70, selling 3,000 units. Let's say our monopolist wants to sell 4,000 units. So our monopolist knows, thanks to the demand curve, that if it wants to do that, it has to drop its price to $60. So if you kind of note, you can see that we mentioned this earlier in the semester, revenue is given by price times quantity. So when we're back at our original setup here, this rectangle here, area of this whole rectangle, gives us our total revenue at selling 3,000 units at $70. If we instead sell 60, or if instead we charge a price of $60 and sell 4,000 units, now this rectangle here gives us our total revenue. So you can see the two effects here. The price effect has gone down, so we're now charging less for each unit, but we're now selling 1,000 more units. So this rectangle here is our measure of the price effect. So every unit that we sell, we're now decreasing the amount that we get by $10. So the price effect is $10 times 3,000 units, or $30,000 lost in marginal revenue. This area here is the output effect. So the output effect in this case is $60 times 1,000 units, or $60,000. So you combine these two together and you get the overall marginal revenue is going to be 60,000 minus 30,000 or $30,000. Okay, so then how is our monopolist going to decide how much to produce? Well, our monopolist is going to produce where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So we saw in that graph right before that marginal revenue curve is downward sloping. We can overlay that with our cost curves. We're going to find a quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. And then we just find that quantity, and then the monopolist is going to charge a price at where that quantity crosses the demand curve. And then the monopolist profits are going to be that quantity times the vertical distance between the price and the average total cost curve, same as with perfect competition. Let me say that one more time. So if you want to find quantities and profits for a monopolist, step one, find a quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That gives you the quantity. The price at which the monopolist is going to charge is going to be found by tracing that quantity up to the demand curve and then over. That gives you the price that the monopolist charges. And then profits are going to be, or losses, are going to be the vertical distance between the price and the average total cost curve at the quantity that the monopolist produces. So let's see this graphically. Here's our demand curve. Here's our marginal revenue curve. Here's our marginal cost curve. Here's our average total cost curve. Step one, find the quantity at which the monopolist is going to produce. That is going to be the quantity where marginal cost crosses marginal revenue, or right here. Step two is to trace this quantity up to the demand curve and over. That gives you the price that the monopolist is going to charge. How do we know that? Well, if the monopolist is going to sell that quantity, the demand curve tells you the relationship between quantity and price. Step three, to find the monopolist's profits, you find the cost given by the average total cost curve at this quantity. That's right there. And then if price is higher than average total cost, the monopolist is making a profit. If price is lower than average total cost, then the monopolist is losing money. So here, this rectangle gives us the monopolist's profit. Okay, so a summary. Monopolies are basically on the opposite end of the spectrum of market structures from perfect competition. So perfect competition, you have almost an infinite number of firms. Monopolies, you only have one firm. So there's something that keeps other firms from entering and competing with a monopolist. These are known as barriers to entry. And what this means is that in the long run, we're going to have no entry of other firms or no exit. And so there's nothing that's going to drive prices down to that minimum average total cost level. So nothing like that we saw in perfect competition. So monopolists, unlike firms in perfectly competitive markets, have control over the price that they charge. Monopolists don't face a horizontal demand curve, they face a downward sloping demand curve. They still produce at where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And the quantity of profits is still given by quantity sold times price minus average total cost.